So you've actually just seen an example of what I was talking about earlier, which is the difficulty in keeping our mechanistic model and our quantum mechanics models from getting mixed together. And you heard it right here. Because now we're talking about entanglement. What about entanglement? Entanglement is so amazing because, you can separate these particles, these entangled particles, light years apart, make a change to one of them, and the other one corresponds instantly. Instantly. Light years, instantly. Something's going faster than the speed of light. Yeah, it's going faster than the speed of light if you believe that you live in a universe in which space actually exists and time actually exists, but if you aren't, and you aren't, then it's irrelevant. It was just a mistake. You just kind of, I thought it was real cheesecake. It was made out of tofu. What did I know? It tasted the same. It's the same thing. A mistake. So we're going to have to be real careful because these models, a mechanistic model is helpful. It's helpful. If you're going to go to the store and buy some beef or chicken, it's helpful to know how scales work, and scales are mechanistic. Underneath it all, they don't have a mechanistic reality. It's all informational patterns. But if you want to make sure you get your money's worth when you go to the butcher shop, you should know how a scale operates. Well, we have to be careful to keep these models distinct and separate. Separate this way, not separate this way. One is simply a kind of a more complex level of organization of the other, but all made of the same stuff. This is that proof of non-locality that Nick Herbert was talking about. And I'm going to show you this real quickly. Bob and Alice are two observers. We're going to separate them. Let's say one is in New York, the other's in San Francisco. We're going to have a source of entangled photons. So what happens with entangled photons? Make a change in one, it influences the other. And we're going to have a fiber optic that goes left and right, east and west, and one goes to Alice and one goes to Bob. There's going to be a flow of electrons in pairs. They're going to get separated. And Bob and Alice are each going to have a spot detector, a single photon orientation detector. So light, polarizes. Either polarizes with the waves going like this or like this. And so with the spot detector, Bob and Alice can observe these photons coming one at a time, and they can say, well, it's vertical or it's horizontal. And the way they do that is with a calcite crystal. That separates the beam so that you have one of the pair of photons going one direction, one the other direction. So Bob and Alice are always, at the moment they observing parts of the same pair. Okay. These detectors, let's say this is a spot detector, it's oriented vertically. So we want to make sure that both Bob and Alice have their photon detectors oriented the same way, because that would influence the test, wouldn't it? And so both are going to orient at zero angle. And when that's true, they agree in terms of their description of what the photon's orientation is 100% of the time. If one is looking like this through their spot detector and the other is looking like this, they will agree 0% of the time. So with these two facts, plus the method pioneered by John Stuart Bell, we can show that reality has to be non-local at all levels of organization. So this was a situation. There's the light source. Bob and Alice are observing. There's there's a zero error rate in agreement on the orientation of these photons. If Alice rotates 30 degrees to her spot detector, it's going to produce a 25% error rate in their agreement. Okay? If Bob does the same thing that Alice did, but Alice doesn't do it, then he produces a 25% error rate in agreement. What if they both did it at the same time? 30% or 30 degree rotation. What do you suppose would happen? What does logic tell you? No, I mean, it's a 25% error rate from one of them doing this, either one of them doing this. If both of them do it at the same time, it should be what, 50%? Wouldn't logic tell you that it ought to be double that? It's 75%. In other words, the observation that occurs in New York influences the reality in San Francisco. So, if that's the case, reality has to be non-local. End of story. That's it. There's no argument anymore. And Nick kind of alluded to this comment that he's made. This is a quote from him. He says, "We're like King Midas. We're unable to perceive the energetic nature of the universe by our senses because the act of observation causes the universe to manifest physically and not in its true energetic nature." So, this is happening all the time. It's happening all the time. There are no things to observe outside the self. They don't exist. There is nothing to observe outside the self. We cause things to manifest in their physical reality because that's a product of the act of observation. If we do it mindlessly, things manifest in some chaotic or chance-like way. What if we take advantage of this and now we become mindful about the way we look at things? Do you suppose that all of a sudden the world starts behaving differently for us? It looks like it. So if it's true, if non-locality is true, then physical separation is not possible. So space and time are not external objective realities. And instead, we have to see them as a conceptual grid that we lay out the experience of life. It allows us to make sense of our experience of life. Are you living in a computer simulation? You know, one of the things that, David Deutsch is a physicist, mathematician, one of the most famous scientists in the world. He's at Oxford University. And he has made this argument. He's written a number of books. He actually postulates that somewhere in the deep recesses of the universe is a computer. You know, it's like a 31st century Dell or something, I don't know. And that our reality, the whole of the universe, is being simulated within that computer. Nick Bostrom is in the Department of Philosophy, also at Oxford, and there's a paper that you'll find on the internet, you can download it, where he argues that we're living in a computer simulation. That more probably than not, we're living in a computer simulation. Interesting. You know, the possibility that, you know, some teenage kid centuries from now actually has, you know, the iPhone 75, and, you know, like this whole thing is like a game that they're playing, and, you know, all they have to do is hit the game over button and it's all over, is a little bit frightening. It's logical. It's interesting stuff to read. There are other ways of looking at it that I like better. One of those is Tom Campbell. Tom Campbell's written a book called My Big Toe Virtually everything Tom has taught is available on YouTube. So if you don't want to read his book, which is about this thick, you'll find his presentations to be pretty interesting, and all of them are on YouTube. So here's Tom's view of the universe. His view of the universe is that there is nothing outside of consciousness, but that consciousness in its basic state is something you wouldn't even recognize as consciousness, according to comparisons to your own mind. Instead, consciousness was a field, just a blank field. This is not unlike the Old Testament version of Genesis. It's not unlike the Hindu version of the origin of the world. It's not unlike many other views of how things came, a Buddhist view, out of a void, out of nothing, except infinite potential. Some people describe this as the mind of God. And I don't disagree with that necessarily. I certainly don't have an argument against it. David Bohm had an argument against it. He was interviewed by Renee Weber. Thank you. Yeah, Renee. Renee Weber, who's a psychologist at Ohio State University, and she actually has written a book about Bohm. And she asked him, talking about this implicate order is the term that he referred to. We're talking about the same thing. You see a lot of people talk about this informational universe, and they use different terms, but they're talking about the same thing. And she asked him, so she said, is this God that we're talking about? And he was kind of nonplussed. He said, I don't know how to answer the question. I don't even understand the question. I don't see how it could possibly be God. If we can describe and understand this field, it couldn't possibly be God. God is far beyond, just the idea of God is far beyond anything that the mind of man can, put itself around. In the military, they say it's above your pay grade. So, nevertheless, what we're talking about, we can describe by what we do know. We don't have to put attributes on it and say it's the mind of God or it isn't the mind of God or anything else. Well, let's just talk about what we know. And Campbell describes this universe then beginning in a primary state. In the beginning, there was void. And nothing but potential. Campbell talks about what he calls the fundamental principle. And the fundamental principle is what drives the manifestation, the maturation, the transformation of the universe. And he says that the universe has one desire, and that is to decrease its entropy, decrease its disorder, increase its synergy, its order, its beauty, its logic. It's an art project. It's a big art project. That's what it is. It has no preferences except what works, what's logical, what fits into this order that it's creating. And when I say it is creating, remember that you are a sentient being. You are a subset of that larger order. You are doing its work. Everything that you do as you learn and grow and develop and mature is not separate from that universe and its process of decreasing its entropy, increasing its order and synergy. So as Campbell talks about it then, at some point there was a distinction, a duality. I don't mean duality in the sense that the Advaita philosophers talk about it. That's a duality that says there's something other than consciousness. We know there isn't. I mean a duality within consciousness, a distinction of this from that. Now it's no longer a void. And think of it as a 0 and a 1, a black and a white, a registration of difference. And what Campbell talks about is that this process occurred in a random way, and that at some point, this organization of pattern within the universe took on a complexity which allowed for a self-awareness. And that self-awareness or sentience within the universe allowed the universe to self-direct its change and its transformation. Not in a particular predetermined direction, so that change might occur in a particular way until it was recognized that it really wasn't productive in meeting the fundamental principle of decreasing entropy and increasing order and synergy and beauty and logic. And so it would be abandoned. And the universe would explore other niches and opportunities to meet that fundamental principle. And at some point in that development, individual sentient organisms arose. It's not my native language. My native language is actually grunts, but so these sentient structures, beings, arose. In a way, we can think of ourselves as sentient beings as the eyes of the universe, the eyes with which the universe sees itself. Kind of like going into a clothes shop. You can look at a single mirror, but isn't it nice to have one of those fold-out mirrors so that you can see many different perspectives? It gives you a different understanding, doesn't it? And so each of us is like a mirror for the whole of the universe, for it to see itself and to be better able to do its business of decreasing its order, decreasing its entropy, increasing its order and synergy. Goswami, Amit Goswami, you may be familiar with, he's written a number of books, another physicist. He's from University of Oregon. This is how he describes it. And this picture is one that he produced. The U standing for the universe, the eyeball, as the universe observes itself, it develops. It's really, I think, kind of a neat little graphic. And so he describes this as kind of a self-assembly. So he's really talking about the same thing as Campbell. Entropy and order, non-living systems, it's kind of interesting. Entropy increases. In other words, stuff falls apart. Living systems, entropy decreases. As living systems grow and develop, their pattern, their organization, comes to higher and higher levels. There's a book I recommend that you get. This is by a physicist named Scott Tyson, and it's really great. A lot of this physics stuff can be difficult to understand. The reason I want to go over it, and hopefully go over it in a conversational way, is that if you're going to be successful at this work, this model of the universe and reality needs to be more real for you than the mechanistic, deterministic, materialistic model that we've grown up with and is around us. And if that's not true, then the materialistic model will dominate. And the work that needs to occur in the domain of mind will be misinformed fundamentally by that misunderstanding. So that's why we're spending the time. The Unobservable Universe, you can download it for $4.99 on Kindle, and it's a fantastic book. It's a fabulous book. I've read a lot of quantum mechanics stuff from the time I was 16, and this is, if you're going to read one book, just read this one. There's Scott. There's a YouTube interview. Scott's a terrific writer. Unfortunately, he's not the greatest interviewee, so it's, but you might want to watch his interview on YouTube. Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel laureate in physics and a beloved teacher, I think he was at Princeton, passed away a number of years ago. Feynman said that you can understand the whole of quantum mechanics and the nature of the universe by the dual slit experiment and all of its implications and variations. And The dual slit experiment is this. In other words, we have a barrier, a wall, we have a light source, and we have two slits. And photons go through the light source, and they strike a wall. Let's say it's a photographic plate, so that we could record this. What happens is that these light waves, just the same thing would happen if you did it in the bathtub. If you got in the bathtub and you put a thing across the bathtub and you put two slits in it, and you dropped the soap bar on one side of the bathtub and you made waves, and the waves hit the barrier and the two slits. When the waves went through, what would happen is those slits would serve as two sources now of wave, and the waves would interact just the way it happens if you drop a couple rocks in a puddle and the waves interact. And the result of the reinforcement or canceling of those waves, depending on how they line up with each other, gives a characteristic pattern over here, an interference pattern. And what it looks like is this. This is a double slit pattern, dual slit pattern. And this is a single slit pattern. This is what photons, same source of photons would look like going through a single slit. The interesting thing about the dual slit experiment is that the light source can be a single stream of photons. One photon going through a dual slit setup will produce the interference pattern. You might ask yourself, A, how can one photon go through two slits? And B, how can it interfere with itself? I interfere with myself all the time. I can't get out of my own way. Feynman described it. He said what happens is that there's an infinite number of possibilities for that photon to be. It happens to be in the place I observe it because I'm observing it. And what it's interacting with is all of its potential other states. And so that, he says, explains it. Tyson describes something really interesting. And that is, if you do this experiment with one photon, you don't know if the photon's going to go through slit A or slit B. It's going to go through one of those, but you don't know which one. If you use a polarizing filter, the polarizing filter will tell you which one it's going through, but it won't otherwise change the photon. So now, this photon goes through and you get an interference pattern, but now you superimpose a polarizing filter, and what do you suppose happens? The interference pattern disappears. It doesn't interfere with itself. Why? Because you know with certainty where it's going to go. It has no other possibility. It has no other potential to be. You have locked it in. Your intention has locked it in. And it changes the image on the photographic film. That's cool. This handsome devil is Robert Lanza, an interesting guy, and again, a fellow that you'll find a bunch of stuff on YouTube. Lanza is an MD. Here he's on the front of Fortune magazine. This is a guy whose name is usually compared to people like Einstein. He's a guy who is considered, odds-on favorite for being a Nobel laureate himself. And his personal story is amazing. If you read his book, Biocentrism, it's pretty cool. You may have heard of Lanza. There was a big article in the New York Times last week. His group, his specialty is in cloning, and his group has developed a way to take adult human cells and change them into omnipotential, totipotential stem cells that can be used just like embryonic stem cells, but you don't have to use embryonic tissues, which means quite a bit to certain people. Yeah, he's an amazing fellow. And he was one of Time's, most interesting, I think they call it, most interesting 100 people. His book, Biocentrism, is a wonderful book. Really what it is, and these are not new ideas. These ideas have been around for thousands of years. It's a restatement of Advaita philosophy, which goes back thousands of years and is the kind of the intellectual version of Hinduism. It's a restatement of Advaita philosophy in modern scientific terms. And the view of Advaita philosophy is there's nothing outside the self. There's nothing outside the self. And when we say self, we don't mean yourself or yourself. We mean the big self that we're all part of. And I just want to go through the 7 principles of biocentrism according to Lanza. The first principle of biocentrism is what we perceive as reality is a process that involves our consciousness. And external reality, if it existed, would, by definition, have to exist in space. But this is meaningless because space and time are not absolute realities, but rather tools of the human and animal mind. So, materialism you're going to have to throw out. It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. It doesn't correspond to what science says is real. And as Nick Herbert told us, quantum mechanics is the creme de la creme. This is the best model humans have ever created. And the kind of things that we're able to do with the quantum mechanical model populate our lives, dominate our lives. Everything that we have, you know, the electronics, the computers, all of these things are a product of that model of reality. And if you let go of that model of reality, you can't create those things because you don't have an accurate enough picture of the way things are to build them. The second principle of biocentrism is our external and internal perceptions are inextricably intertwined. They are different sides of the same coin and cannot be divorced from one another. What you see on the outside and what you experience on the inside are part of the same thing. Third principle of biocentrism, the behavior of subatomic particles, indeed all particles and objects. There's been a lot of experimentation on this recently, and scaling up from individual photons and particles to atoms to big atoms like buckyballs, you know, big super molecules. I said atoms, I meant molecules. And in fact, even larger structures have been shown experimentally to be inextricably linked to the presence of the observer. Without the presence of a conscious observer, they at best exist in an undetermined state of probability waves. That's what Nick Herbert was saying earlier. Without consciousness, this is the fourth principle of biocentrism, matter, you notice how he put matter in quotes? You know, the stuff we used to call matter, dwells in an undetermined state of probability. Any universe that could have preceded consciousness only existed in a probability state. So you've heard of things like the multiple universes theory, you know, and this is another mix-up, I think, of the materialistic and the quantum view, is that you read a lot of scientists, these are quantum scientists, and they talk about this multiple universes theory as if there really was actually another universe. You know, you could, you know, if you had the right engine and tires, you could drive your car there maybe. But in a universe of infinite possibility that occurs within a domain of mind, there could be an infinite number of universes. The universe you're in is the universe you're paying attention to. It's the universe you're aware of. The fifth principle of biocentrism is the structure of the universe is explainable only through biocentrism. The universe is fine-tuned for life, which makes perfect sense as life creates the universe, not the other way around. You know, if it was the other way around, you go, wow, what a lucky coincidence. I'm here. Can't believe how I got so lucky. But if indeed the universe arises out of consciousness, then It's perfectly logical. It couldn't be any other way. The universe is simply the complete spatio-temporal logic of the self. And again, we're talking about the big self. The sixth principle of biocentrism is time does not have a real existence outside of animal sense perception. It is the process by which we perceive changes in the universe. Seventh principle of biocentrism is space, like time, is not an object or thing. Space is another form of our animal understanding and does not have an independent reality. We carry space and time around with us like turtles with their shells. Thus, there is no absolute self-existing matrix in which physical events occur independent of life. Life is not a happy coincidence or a lucky offshoot of the mixing together at random of chemicals in a primordial ooze. Instead, life is the prerequisite thing, and everything else is downline from life. So non-locality, if it's true, then actual separation is not possible. Space and time are not external objective realities, but only a conceptual grid for us to understand our experience of life. Feel alone. Sure, sure. It's not possible. It's not possible. Just not possible. You know, Anna, one of the things that, one of the ways of looking at it that I've had is that, you know, we hear the word original sin and everybody has their idea of what that means. And I think that original sin is the mistake of separation. And everything else arises from that. All fear arises from that. You know, you look in the newspaper today, you'll see it looks like it's either 1939, 1914, 1860. You know, I mean, and it all arises, all of this arises from the simple mistake of duality and separation. And address that one issue, and everything else takes care of itself. Try to take care of everything itself and put out all those fires, and you never get there. You never get there. So, very good observation. Thank you. So, non-locality implies no particles actually exist. They couldn't exist. If you have two particles, you got to have two places to put them. There's only one place, and it's a domain of mind. And if matter and energetic particles aren't actually possible, then the real world of physical things, causally, materially interacting in space, can't be actual. And you'll see, I'll use that distinction between real and actual. Real is real. Nobody's saying your experience isn't real. The question is whether it's actual, whether it matches the model that you happen to have in your mind that interprets that experience. And if it's a materialistic model, sorry, you're going to have to find a better model because it just doesn't work. It doesn't explain the universe well. Some people have trouble with that. I remember a number of years ago doing a seminar in Chicago, and there's a fellow who was an NMT practitioner from, I don't know, maybe the second NMT seminar, and a good one. He was a chiropractor, and this is when I first started kind of coming out of the closet as a non-materialist, you know. Say it loud, say it proud. And I was, I don't know, about 2/3 of the way through the presentation, and he just stood up. He didn't raise his hand. He was a big guy, and just one of those kind of guys. And he says, "Hold on," he says. "Are you telling me that my wife, my daughter, are nothing but informational patterns in a field of consciousness? Is that what you're telling me?" And I said, "Yes, Joe, that's what I'm telling you." "I can't buy that. I've got to draw the line somewhere. That's where I'm drawing it." I said, "Well, Joe, if your wife and your daughter were made out of tiny little indivisible particles, would you feel better about it? I mean, would they be more meaningful to you if they were that instead of a spirit, instead of a thought, an idea? I'm not sure we ever connected on that. He hasn't been back to another seminar, so maybe that answers the question. But some people feel cheated. You know, it's kind of like if you'd opened up a Christmas present and the box was empty. You go, hey, hey. But the fact is that if you let go of the materialistic model, you haven't lost anything. Instead, what you've you have lost something, because what you've lost is the limitations that go along with the materialistic model. And what you've gained is infinite possibility, infinite potential, as David Bohm would say. Therefore, the real world must be completely informational, non-material, and generically spiritual. I don't want to carry along, at least in this discussion, any of the connotations that go with spiritual, because everybody kind of attaches their own meaning to that. But if you look it up in the dictionary, what spiritual means is having no material basis. That's what it means. So it is informational, and the experience of the whole of the world is occurring within a domain of mind. So without these imagined constraints of materialism, separation, and causality, new possibilities emerge. I want to take a look at another video. It's a short one from Fred Alan Wolf. Fred is another guy you should look up on YouTube. You'll find a lot of these videos there. He was one of the first of the quantum physicists to go out on the road like a rock star. I remember back in the 70s looking at it's now Arlene Schnitzer Hall here, where they do a lot of presentation. It was the Paramount back then. And seeing in the newspaper, Fred Alan Wolf, PhD, quantum physicist, was doing his show. I thought, wow, that's kind of weird that quantum physicists are being treated like rock stars now. I think I want to be a quantum physicist.
As a physicist, we began to wonder how the universe got here in the first place. And the current thinking is that it big banged into existence. Or there might have been multiple bangs. Some of them disappeared after a while. So it might have gang banged into its existence. Whatever happened to it, it came out of nothing. Now by nothing, most people think in a big empty space of nothing. Not even space was there. No time, no space, no matter, no energy, no thought, no consciousness, nada. Out of this vibrant nothingness, matter, energy, space, time, consciousness, mind emerged, came out. Technologically speaking, quantum physics is, the cat's pajamas. It's the major theory of our Western world today in terms of science. What it told us is that if the universe is not made of things, then how does it come into being? And the answer seems to be it comes into being when an observer observes anything in it. So it's opened up the door to fantastical kind of thinking, new ways of envisioning, and opens this door to, well, how is it that an observer, by looking, can change what's being looked at? Well, some people only think they have to think great thoughts, and some people they think that thought creates reality, and they think if they just sit on their butts and think great thoughts, great things are going to appear right before their eyes, and it doesn't work that way at all. Never has, never will. You're in a body. This body has matter. It's massive. It's got form and shape and energy and all kinds of things that we physicists have figured out. Maybe not completely, but have figured out what's going on. And inertia and all the wonderful things that are in what's called a universe of matter. If it was just thought into activity without matter around, well, that would be boring, because any jackass can make a mountain of gold. What the hell value would gold have if that were the case? So in order to have value, in order to have structure, in order to have meaning, in order to have something rather than nothing, we need to be able to have resistance to just thinking things into existence and hoping for the better. I find it utterly devastating to teach people, so-called false teachers, that come out and tell you, oh, you think and everything will happen wonderfully for you. It doesn't work that way. You've got to put some effort into it. And we all know that. What we're missing is where the thought comes from in the beginning to even give you the idea that maybe thought can change reality. First of all, it does not exist in space and time. In other words, it isn't something real, if by real we mean material, tangible, physical, there rather than here. It doesn't exist like that. It's a realm of unborn, uncreated, unoriginated, unformed, out of which born, created, original, and form comes into being. So it's a realm in which is neither space nor time, out of which space and time come into being. Everybody's in contact with that realm because you can't help but be in contact with the realm because your thoughts themselves are arising from that realm. In fact, mind is an emergent phenomena from that realm. The big thing we're talking about here is a new way of thinking about this thing we call the person, the self, the beingness, the I. And as we begin to modify what we mean by that, we could begin to see and touch upon this infinite realm that I'm speaking about, this realm of non-existence out of which existence comes.
So you've heard, what you've just heard is interesting in a couple of ways. One way is, again, the mixing together of the materialistic model and the quantum mechanical model. We live in a world of energy and matter, and things have mass and form, and so you can't just look at things and think big thoughts and everything changes the way you want. But another take on that is not that there is actual mass or energy, but that there are different levels of organization of information. And in fact, that's the way I look at it, and I think will be helpful for you to look at in regard to the transformations we're trying to create with people. Things have to fit into the universe's logic. Why can't you look at a mountain and change it into a mountain of gold by observing? You can look at a electron and make it turn into a particle from a wave. Why can't you make a mountain turn into a mountain of gold? And he makes a great point, because then what meaning would gold have? It would have no value, it would have no meaning. There would be nothing like gold in the universe if gold was as common as dirt. So it doesn't fit into the logic that the universe has organized itself. So it's not possible. Let's say it's possible, it's way improbable. When you have someone in front of you and you're working with them, maybe they have a broken bone. You can make instantaneous changes, but you're not going to make instantaneous changes on a physical level. You're going to make instantaneous changes on a process level. Because process is something that's a less concrete and rigid form of organization of information. And because it's less concrete, and because it's moving and flowing, process is what? You know, a thing may be a thing. We see it as something non-changing. But process, by definition, is changing. And what we're really doing by our intention is kind of like what you do when you used to do when you were a kid and there was a long family trip in the car and you stick your hand out the window and you kind of make the air go, right? And, that'll keep you entertained for a couple hours. And that's what we're doing with our intention. We're changing the flow of process. And matter, structure in the body, is downline from process. Every bone, every hair on your head, everything in you flowed as a result of process that began within one cell. And actually began even before that with a hot date somewhere where your parents went out. Yeah, we won't get it. Yeah, we're going to look at one more. This is Fred again, and he's going to talk about shamanism.
As I understand it, when you look at, for example, in the book of Genesis, the story of creation, and read it from this Kabbalistic perspective, you get a vision of the creation that's not so different than the one you might find in physics.
Basically, that's true. The Kabbalists have a symbol for creation. It's Beit, the second letter of the Hebrew Aleph Beit, and alphabet comes from Aleph Beit, obviously, and it means several meanings, which are all related. It means a container. It also means a house. That's where temples are called Beit or Beth something. That Beth is another pronunciation of Beit. But it also means, in the Tarot system, it means the magician, that which creates. So it has a creative element in it. But the secret of creation is containment. So in order to create something, you have to contain something from something else. You have to make a distinction. I think G. Spencer Brown wrote about the first distinction. So in a way, Kabbalah is indicating how things are created from nothing.
Now, one of the principles that you have developed, linking your background in physics, your work as a physicist, with the work of mystics and shamans, is that all of you are concerned with vibration.
Yes. Yes, right.
Like the sound of these words of power are vibrations.
Yes, in fact, the idea of vibration as being a major facet to not only the ancient Kabbalists' view, but also the shamanic view, was something I discovered and then discovered again. My teacher, Carlos Suarez, in Paris, when I was living in Paris, had taught me about this, and that was back in 1974, and then it rekindled in 1989 after spending time with the Peruvian shamans. I remember the first time I met Jorge Gonzalez Ramirez, who is a Peruvian shaman, and I asked him simple questions like, well, how do you heal somebody? And then I said, well, before you answer that question, I said, how do you know when someone's sick? And he says, oh, I can tell by their vibration. I said, oh, their vibration. Well, how do you do that? And so then he reaches over, and just like I'm reaching over, he grabs my wrist, and he starts holding my wrist like this. And then I said, oh, and, I'm thinking, this guy's, maybe primitive. And, you mean pulse. That's what you mean. You mean pulse. And then he says, that too. And then I realized that when he's speaking about vibrations or bodily vibrations, he's not just speaking about the pulse, but he's speaking about a number of different vibrational energies that are present in the body. Well, after I talked with him and then had an experience with him in which I directly felt his vibration in a shamanic trance state that I entered with him, I then had talked, even before and afterwards, I had talked with a number of other shamans in different parts of the world, Anglo-Saxon shamans, Druids. I talked with shamans from different Indian tribes, the Chumash Indians down in Ventura, California, also the Ogallala Sioux in South Dakota. And they all keyed me into the idea that vibration was extremely important in their worldview. So when I wrote the book, The Eagle's Quest, I decided that in order for me as a physicist to make sense out of all of this, I'm really going to have to approach it from as much of a scientific viewpoint as I can. So I made up a series of postulates or hypotheses. And the first hypothesis, the major one, is that the shamans see the universe as made of primal vibrational stuff. And that really tied into my understanding of quantum physics, because in quantum physics we talk about quantum waves, which are vibrations, out of which all matter is eventually is created or emerges. Yeah. So there was a direct tie-in right there.
And these quantum waves, as I understand them, are non-physical in the sense that they are probability waves.
Exactly right. And it's very similar to the shamanic idea. Quantum physics is a very bizarre business. I mean, it's the business of business, and nothing could be further from our normal sense of reality than that business. Yeah. It deals with things which are, in a sense, unobservable, out of which we feel all observable phenomena will arise or arises. And one of the basic assumptions of quantum physics is the quantum wave nature of all matter. That matter, unobserved, matter on its own, moves and vibrates in waves. But waves of what? Are they water waves? Are they sound waves? Are they electrical waves? No, they're actually waves of nothing. They're called probability waves. And probability is something that you do in your brain, in your mind. You think. You determine what's probable and what's not probable. So we're dealing with something which is akin to almost mind stuff, if you will. This is not really too much of a surprise. Physicists already had a shock to their system delivered in 1905 when Einstein pointed out that there was no ether to support waves of light. So when a light wave is waving, what is it waving in? It's also waving in nothing. So light is a kind of halfway between material and energetic reality that we see in terms of substance and almost the mind of God, if you will.
Yeah. One of your other hypotheses is that shamans work with the realm of mythos, of myths and legends. And I get a sense that this quantum probability waving around in nothingness could very well be the same stuff of myths.
In fact, I would suggest, although I imagine some scientists might find this more difficult to accept, that it is a kind of a myth. We have myths about subatomic reality. There isn't anybody alive who's ever seen a subatomic particle, that it captured one and held one in their hands or put one in a bottle and examined it. And quantum waves are something like this. In fact, I would suggest that what scientists do is to create myths that they can substantiate through the process of mathematics and through the process of observation. But what they observe and what they believe is creating what they observe are often quite separate from each other. So in a certain sense, quantum physics is a myth that Western culture lives by.
What I think I hear you saying is that there's a process of reification going on, that the quantum physicists set up their experiments in a certain way to create these results, and then they say, this is the objective world out there.
Exactly.
And not always acknowledging their role in creating it.
Exactly. It's the original spirit of science, which I think begins almost with Sir Francis Bacon, is the notion that there is such a thing as an objective world. And probably if we look back through history, we can see the concept arising in the early Greeks, maybe with Democritus, and the notion of that there were atoms of stuff which were fundamental. And the idea of an objective reality was somehow to separate or remove the human brain or the mind from this objective reality. So somehow we have the idea that an observer observed what was already out there. But in the quantum realm, when you set up an experiment, you're not just observing what's already out there, you're participating with what's out there, and in a sense you are actually creating your experience of what's happening out there. So if you look for certain phenomena one way, you see phenomena in that way. If you look for it in another way, you see it in a contradictory guise. The so-called wave-particle duality is an example of this, or the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, the position and momentum of an object is another example of this.
Well, would you say that the various shamans that you worked with in different cultures, each with their own mythological system, are doing something much the same?
I would say there's a very strong tie-in here. Shamans, for example, deal in a world of spirits. They deal in mythological connections between events. They're in a world that Jung would call a world of synchronicity. For example, in China, if a shaman is going to heal you, and on that particular day when the shaman is coming to you, he notices a bird flying north to south or east to west, that will affect your healing. In other words, that's a message to him about what type of healing you need to undergo. So the shamans are constantly dealing with, I would say, synchronicities and mythical elements. A bird doesn't just mean a bird, it means something having to do with flight, or it may have something to do with the dead spirit that's flown. Because of their belief structure in this, as much as our scientific belief structure in things like particles, they see the world differently. Western scientists see the world in a certain way. We have jokes about, well, don't mind him, he's just a physicist, or something like that, because physicists seem to be so quirky about trying to analyze everything and see everything in terms of separate parts. Well, this is a penchant, a way of seeing that physicists have developed as a result of their training. In a very similar way, shamans have developed a way of seeing because of their training, and their training is actually longer in time than the training of a physicist.
I thought that was really worth seeing. And that is what we're up against, really, in our work, is a scientific community in which experimentation is set up in certain ways, observations are made in certain ways, and a body of knowledge is created as a result of that, for the most part without any realization that the act of observing and the intention to see creates that which is seen. And so we get this impression then that we're dealing with an external objective reality that limits us or directs us in a particular way. The work that we're going to be doing, I think you all have a pretty good idea from this point, at this point, is going to be one of changing the mind-body awareness of itself and the conditions that it's experiencing so that it can make choices that lead it in a preferable direction instead of the direction that it's locked into. And we're going to do that communication at an other than conscious level. Other than conscious, I like that term better than subconscious because of all the stuff that connotations get attached to the word subconscious. So other than conscious just means that. It just means that it's, you can ask a person, well, you know what your conscious mind does? Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, okay, well, this is other than that. Oh, okay, I got it. Yeah, right. Well, they will. But at least they let you move on and move forward, which is the point. And so we're going to have this kind of a dialogue. We're going to structure it in a condition-relevant and informationally rich way so that the mind-body really has an opportunity to see very clearly, not in a vague sort of way, but very clearly what's going on now and what the potential is, what could go on, what's the state from which we want to transform, and what's the state to which we want to transform. And that transformation is going to occur within a domain of mind. It's going to occur as a result of a reorganization of the information and the logic within the mind-body. And I don't want to diminish you guys, but really, you're not healing anything. You're like a tour guide, you know? You're like a tour guide for someone who just otherwise wouldn't appreciate all of the highlights of the city. But you're a really classy tour guide, so I don't want to diminish you too much. The question that needs to be answered clearly and in a way that doesn't leave any room for doubt is whether this kind of communication can occur. This fellow is Jacobo Grinberg Zilberbaum, and he's from Mexico City. He taught at UNAM, which is a big university in the south of the city. He did some experiments in 1993, published in 1994. In 1994, he disappeared under curious circumstances. It's still not known what happened to him. The only thing that is known is he hasn't shown up since. So he and Jimmy Hoffa are probably playing poker together somewhere. It's really a sad thing. He was a brilliant guy. You can find a lot to read. We won't talk about the stories or conjecture, but you find a lot to read about him. His work was studied by David Bohm and by the researcher Karl Pribram, the neurologist Karl Pribram. If you're familiar with the idea of holographic theory of mind, that information isn't stored at one or another place within the brain, but in fact distributed throughout the brain as a hologram of the brain. So Pribram came to study with Zilberbaum and left saying that this was pretty fascinating stuff, needed to be explored further. Shortly after that, Zilberbaum disappeared, and no further studies have been done. I don't know how much you know about the world of research, but it's kind of, I don't know, not different from what I understand the world of, movie stars is in Hollywood, you know. You don't go into certain areas of research, because if it's not a popular area and you want to explore that area, you're not going to be hired. You're not going to get grants. You're not going to get money. So you explore the same stuff that everybody else explores because, you know, it pays the mortgage, it puts a car in your garage, and chicken in the pot. In any case, you can find the article, 1994 article from Physics Essays, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen Paradox in the Brain, the Transferred Potential. Notice this name, Amit Goswami, the physicist I was talking about earlier, was one of the co-authors of this study. And the study was this. Experimental subjects were brought into a laboratory. The laboratory had two rooms. The rooms were Faraday caged, meaning that no electromagnetic radiation could go between them. If you had your cell phone and you were in one room, you couldn't call the person in the other room because you wouldn't get a signal. It was lightproof and sound resistant is the term they used, so it wasn't completely soundproof. They wired up both the subjects in the pairs of subjects with EEG devices so that they could record their brain waves. So there was an experimental group and there was a control group. The control group, the experimental group, was instructed to spend 15, 20 minutes together and during that 15 or 20 minutes, they were instructed to hold the intention to communicate with one another at a subconscious level. share information at a subconscious level. Just that. The control group, everything was the same except they weren't given that instruction. So they take pairs from the experimental group, pairs from the control group, and each of these pairs of people they put into the booths. One of the pairs, they flash, I believe it was 100 flashes per second, per minute maybe it was, of a strobe light. And when you flash a strobe light, what happens is the occipital cortex, the visual cortex of the brain, lights up on an EEG. You get a signal, you get a pattern. Well, that's not surprising. What is surprising is that at the exact same moment, the exact same pattern shows up in the occipital cortex of the person who didn't receive strobe lights, but had been part of this pair group that was instructed to hold the intention to share information. Same thing with the control group. They're put in. One of them gets the flashes. He's the only one that gets the EEG result. The other person doesn't. There's only one thing you can conclude from that, and that is that human minds can transfer information between one another simply on the basis of intending to do so. And if they simply don't have an awareness that it's possible, it doesn't happen.
Did the second person also have that same understanding of intention to communicate, both people in the pair?
Yeah, because they were part of the experimental group. So the whole group, just like all right, you guys, when you get together, here's what you're going to do. So everybody in the group understood, but the control group didn't have any awareness of that at all. Rupert Sheldrake. Some of you may be aware of Sheldrake. He's another guy that if you don't read his books, you're really missing out. But if you don't read his books, you can at least go to his website and you'll find videos, you'll find lectures, you'll find debates, which are really a gas because he's not only super smart, but he's really funny in that British way that's real understated and dry. And the other person kind of goes, ugh, when he makes them feel really silly. Which is sheldrake.org is the website. Sheldrake developed in 1981, he published a book called A New Science of Life. And this book was fairly popular. The scientific journal Nature, very famous, well-respected journal, described his book as the best candidate for book burning of the year. He was separated from Oxford University, where he taught as a biologist, a PhD biologist for years, and continued with his research and lectures and teaching. And I understand several years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, he was offered a lot of money by Oxford to come back and, please, Rupert, come back, do any research you want, we love you, because his views all of a sudden are congruent with the consciousness that's going around now. Here's what he says about what he calls the extended mind. And I'm just going to read this. So, a metaphor that helps in thinking about the extended mind is provided by one of the simplest forms of animal life, the single-celled amoeba. Amoebas move around by sending out projections into the world around them. These are called pseudopodia, literally meaning false feet. As in all other complex animals, amoeboid cells are vital for our survival. For example, some of the white blood cells, the macrophages, are amoeboid and send out pseudopodia that engulf bacteria and other foreign bodies, just as free-living amoebas in the ponds gobble up bacteria by engulfing them. The most extreme examples of amoeboid cells are the nerves. Some nerve cells have enormously elongated pseudopod-like projections that serve as the nerve fibers that conduct nerve impulses. It's no coincidence that the mind is rooted in networks of nerve cells, with pseudopod-like axons stretching far beyond the main part of the cell body. The mind, in turn, is capable of sending out mental pseudopodia into the world beyond the body and is forming networks of interconnections with other minds. That's happening all the time. The only thing we're talking about doing it is in a structured, mindful, directed way. It's interesting. There's research that shows that children, until the age of about 7, believe that their mind extends outside their heads. It's just natural. And then you send them to school and, oh, beat that nonsense out of you. My golly. Crazy thoughts, you kids. So, and Sheldrake talks about formative causation. How do things arise in the structure that they are? And he says that there are informational fields. And those fields inform the organization of matter. And really, it's another description of the kind of thing that we've been talking about all morning, which is this idea that within mind are organized these fields, not separate from the whole, but distinct. And what was Fred Wolf saying? He's saying to create something of meaning and significance, you have to separate one, not separate, you have to create distinction between one thing and another to allow for something to arise. Innate yogurt consciousness. This is Gordon Cooper. He was an astronaut. He was the one that, I don't know if he did it with permission, but he got a deck of those PSI cards, with the circle and the square and the triangle to try to see if you can communicate through over distance. Anyway, he's introducing.
The bacteria that changes milk into yogurt are the subjects of the latest experiments of Cleve Baxter, the lie detector expert who discovered primary perception in plants. Cleve is using an electroencephalograph, the instrument that is normally used to monitor human brain waves, to discover if communication channels exist at the single-cell level. Cleve would like to know if the single-celled yogurt bacteria are aware of the events in the lives of other yogurt bacteria.
During the past years, as we've tried to explore how far down the evolutionary line this apparent perception capability extends, we've finally gotten all the way down to single-celled organisms. Namely, in the present time, we're utilizing the bacteria contained in commercially available yogurt. Now, bacteria are still flora, still plant life, and it's very interesting concerning some of the results we've been obtaining. The thing that we have done in an experiment that should, we feel, be very repeatable is to completely automate the experiment, to program it, automate it, get the experimenter completely out of the laboratory environment. Now, when we have done this and carefully followed those precautions, we've been able to collect data. And the experimental format has gone in this manner. First, we have taken a small sample of the yogurt and put it in a glass vial, glass container. This container is included in a metal box that's shielding the yogurt from outside electromagnetic spectrum energies, electrical interference. The lead goes to the instrumentation, which in this particular case is not the conventional polygraph equipment, but we've switched over to electroencephalograph. Now, the electroencephalograph is instrumentation ordinarily used to monitor brain waves from humans. The thing that we found is that we can get a consistent and meaningful recording on the EEG from a yogurt sample, and the problem now, of course, was to build into the experiment a remote stimulus. Now, the remote stimulus that we've used in this particular case is to feed nutrient to a sample of the same yogurt located a considerable distance away in the same laboratory environment. So through automation, we've allowed milk, which is food to yogurt, to be dropped into the container of yogurt, and then, of course, through automation, we've checked the charts to see what happened on this other sample of yogurt located a considerable distance, 40 or 50 feet away from the sample receiving the nutrient, and this sample, by the way, in no way being attached to the EEG equipment. Now, this has given us a lot of insight in being able to establish quite firmly that the perception that we're calling primary perception actually extends down to the single-celled organism. And this, I think, is going to be very important. Now, the silver electrodes are immersed in the yogurt sample, and this is clamped into place. So I'll place this down into the metal shielded box, and go balance the yogurt sample in on the EEG. I'm going to take some of the nutrient and bring it into the syringe, which is milk, and I'm going to add the nutrient to the container of yogurt that I have in my hand. Now actually, some yogurt from the same batch is being tested in the shielded cage. And the expectation is rather interesting. Now, after adding the nutrient, in fact, with about 10 or 15 seconds delay, we can get some additional reaction. The interesting part is, though, that the reward is being given not to the sample that's being tested, as you see here, but the sample that's being tested is reacting violently. Now, we won't get into a philosophical discussion of whether this is a positive or a negative equivalent to emotion, but I think it's very, very interesting. If single cells going down to the single-celled organism level in yogurt can be responsive to other cells at the other end of the laboratory, this would seem to indicate, or at least add fortification to the idea that there is a oneness, that there's a communication capability that can, on a need-to-communicate basis, link living substance.
On a need-to-communicate basis, that's an important feature, and something that may be important for at least some of your patients or your clients to understand, and that is that the mind-body enters into this dialogue for the purpose of healing. You know, your Visa PIN number is safe. That's not going to be transferred. You know, the combination to the safe in the basement is not going to be transferred. Information that's relevant to the life of the body. Information that is needed to produce the transformation, the healing transformation you're trying to produce, that's the information that gets shared. So, entropy and order. Each of us is a consciousness platform in a larger field of consciousness, a universal field of consciousness. And we mirror our unique perspective to the universe as a whole, to that field as a whole. And in doing so, we make more efficient its own creative evolution. So the universe wants you to be optimally well because it serves a higher purpose. What is real, manifested in explicate, is what the mind settles on. What it pays attention to, what it's attuned to, what it's aware of, and selects out of an informational field of infinite possibility. So we, as subsets of the greater undivided consciousness, do that same process. It is done in creating the universe. So I'm going to give you a model here. We'll imagine this universe as an informational sea. And we navigate currents of information, meaning and significance, like a rider in a kayak navigates the current of water. Our interest, our intention, our awareness serve as a paddle of our kayak of consciousness by which we move through this informational universe. Just as the kayak rider both influences his movement over the water and is at the same time influenced by the water's currents, we're influenced by change within the whole of the informational universe, and by our interest, attention, awareness, belief, and intention, we influence the universe as a whole. It's always a two-way street. When we're mindful, we're in this way moved to preferred places in time, space, and knowledge within the field. But if we're in a state of mindlessness and fear, then we're moved to locations within the field. In other words, we experience realities that are at best random and at worst are precisely where we don't want to be. So you've heard of the law of attraction. What you point your attention to is what comes your way. How is that? Are you like a magnet pulling something toward you? No, you're projecting something out. There is no external reality. what you pay attention to is what becomes your reality. So we're going to think of matter as condensed energy, energy as condensed information, and information is form and structure within this undivided field of consciousness. All action, all movement, and behavior is change of informational pattern within this same consciousness. I spoke about Advaita philosophy. That's been for years one of my favorites. The writings of Nisargadatta Maharaj, Raman Maharshi, W.H.L. Punja. There are just some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful writers who are very, very readable people, thanks to the British colonialism, or at least readable to speakers of English. And so this is actually from one of the Upanishads, the sacred writings of Hindu literature. And I'm going to just read this for you. In the story of the unenlightened Lord Ram receiving instruction from the teacher Vashishta, Ram is told that there are 7 chakras and 72,000 nadis, or energetic pathways, and that energy travels up the Kundalini. It pierces the 7 chakras, and these energies come together at the crown where Shakti meets Shiva in an elaborate energetic scheme. When finished, Vashishta asks Ram if he understands what he's told him. And Ram answers by essentially recapitulating this story that he's just been told. And Vashishta tells him, no, he says, that's not it at all. There is no Kundalini. There are no chakras. Everything is consciousness. Nothing exists outside of consciousness. It's a story for the unenlightened, an abstracted representation of something that does not exist. And that's really where I hang my hat. I said earlier in talking about other methods of energetic medicine and healing, anything that works for an individual can't be criticized. But, my goal for myself is to get a picture of the world that's as close to what's real and true as possible and to discard the nonsense. And so when I, read people that make things up, or I go to seminars, and I still go to a lot of seminars. There's a series of seminars that's about looking at people and imagining their chakras spinning faster and faster. There's another one that hundreds of people, I've been to all of them, and hundreds of people, anyway. And all you do is you imagine a point, the point where things are, a point where you want things to be. You literally reach out to grab that point within the universe. There it is. And you follow the golden threads that run through the universe to get from where you're at to where you need to be. I just, I have trouble with models that sound like something I read, in storybooks when I was 6. Everything is consciousness. Nothing exists outside of consciousness. And we're going to use structures that are rational and reasonable and sober. And we're going to use that in a way to allow the mind-body to reorganize itself. And if we use models that are inherently unsound or illogical, we're going to be limited by those models. And what I've tried to do with NMT is to create something like an open source kind of programming in which we can structure the language of our transformative dialogue in a way that's not limited by silly misconceptions. This is a picture of brainwaves. I just want to say a few words about this. There's electrical activity in all cells of the body, particularly brain cells, but you saw that even bacterial cells can be measured with an EEG, as Cleve Baxter did. there are certain things that have been observed about frequency ranges for EEG activity of the brain. Certain characteristics of mind occur when we're predominantly in this range or this range or this range. We're never in one range or another. It's always a spectrum. It's just a question of where that spectrum is weighted. So beta consciousness is a state of concentration, arousal, alertness, cognition, higher levels associated with anxiety and disease, feelings of separation, fight or flight. Doesn't sound like a place you want to be, does it? Mm-mm. So this is a state of mind that occurs when we're in a panic, when we're challenged. What do you suppose would happen if you studied NMT, came to a seminar, went home, didn't do anything, somebody comes into your office and they need some help, and you go, you know, I think that NMT might help, and you take out your manual, and you blow the dust off of it, and you go, let's see, there was a pathway about, what's that called, and, oh, yeah. Hold on just a minute. Okay, hold your arm up. Okay, now, all right. And you try to go through it like that, not knowing even what's going to be on the next page. You have no idea because you haven't prepared. Do you suppose that maybe you're going to be in kind of a beta state? And the beta state is associated with what? It's associated with anxiety. It's associated with disease. It's associated with feelings of separation. You know, at the very moment that you want to establish this entanglement or awareness of entanglement, everything's entangled. The only thing that changes with entanglement is awareness of entanglement. Then maybe that's not where you want to be. And what would be the best thing that you could do to prevent yourself from being in that situation? Learn the work really well. Study those DVDs, study the manual, and practice until the elements of this are kind of like the scales that a musician learns. You know, you don't go to see a concert pianist and have him looking at the keyboard trying to figure out where he is on the keyboard. Those are the things that have to be automatic. That's the prerequisite to begin, is you have to learn the fundamentals so that the fundamentals are unconscious. Alpha state, 8 to 14 roughly hertz, associated with relaxation, superlearning, relaxed focus, light trance, increased serotonin production, pre-sleep, pre-awaking drowsiness. That's when the best stuff happens, isn't it? When you have a great idea, isn't it? When you're just about to fall asleep or you're just waking up. Maybe because you're less in your egoic mind and you're more in your quantum mechanical mind. You're more in touch with that universal field of consciousness. It's associated with meditation and the beginning of access to the unconscious mind. Unconscious mind, that's exactly what I wanted access to. I want some of that alpha stuff. And the way we get to that is, how are you going to be relaxed when you're doing NMT? By knowing the work, by studying, by being familiar, by getting some experience. And as your practice of NMT goes along, and as you get more and more experience and it becomes more and more a part of who you are, it becomes the alpha component of your own brainwaves when you're doing NMT become a bigger and bigger component. And therefore your connection, your connectivity with unconscious mind, with all of these things, these characteristics that make for a good NMT session are helped. The theta range, 4 to 7.9 hertz, associated with dream, sleep, increased production of catecholamines, vital for learning and memory, increased creativity, integrative, emotional experiences, potential change in behavior, increased retention of learned material, hypnagogic imagery, trance state, deep meditation, access to unconscious mind. Sounds like that ought to be a large component of how our mind is functioning is really what to say when we're doing NMT. And delta, it's associated with dreamless sleep, human growth hormone release, a deep trance-like non-physical state, loss of body awareness, access to unconscious and collective unconscious. Collective unconscious. Universal consciousness, in other words. So, just something to think about, because do you suppose that if you were aware of this, that your awareness and your understanding that certain characteristics of mind activity would lend itself to better results in your NMT? Do you suppose that simply having that awareness and holding the intention that that should happen would influence the reality of it occurring or not occurring? Do you think it might? I think so. So that's why we bring this up. And do you suppose that if you're in resonance as a field of consciousness, you're in resonance with the field of consciousness of your client, do you suppose that these characteristics could be shielded from your client? How could they? And if there is that resonance, isn't it important that you be real mindful and use care with regard to this? And if you do, isn't there a lot of potential simply by being in that mind state to beneficially influence the mind state of the client? You know, it's kind of like two musical instruments. You know, you sound a note on one and the other across the room starts vibrating. Finding the right mental posture. You ever hear the term monkey mind? Monkey mind? Something that I'm sure you've noticed, you can't be a human, I think, and not notice it, but that you'll become more and more and more and more aware of while you're doing NMT is the degree to which your mind is like a monkey mind. You know, monkey mind meaning this. You go to the zoo and you go to the monkey cages and you watch the monkeys and their attention is like all over the place. You know, they're jumping up on this thing and they're, you know, and they're looking at this guy and who's got a banana and, you know, but we do that same thing. And until you try to find a place of stillness and quiet and serenity and clarity and to sustain that for 20 or 30 minutes at a time and to do that over and over again. I mean, I do that like 8 hours a day, like every day except weekends. And on weekends, I usually do it for a couple hours or so every day because that's how often I'm treating people. So it becomes really, you really notice when you jumped here or jumped there. And that awareness allows you to kind of hone in your focus. And so the advice for you and your mental posture as you're doing NMT is slow down your mind. Not speed it up, slow it down. Still the self-talk and chatter. You know, what do you suppose happens if you're doing NMT and you're going, oh, I don't understand this stuff. I'm so stupid. I should have stayed up last night. I knew this patient was coming in and I don't know this pathway very well. Do you suppose that that gets across just as well to the client as the information that you actually wanted to get across? Yeah. That's the thing about this kind of work, not just NMT, but any kind of energetic interaction is you got to know where you're at. You got to be mindful of that. Because you can have a disorganizing or disruptive influence on a client just as well as you could have a healing influence if your head's not in the right place, if you're not present. And doing this work, you're going to find, you know, I used to ask when people would come back to the second seminar, the first thing I do is I'd ask, how many of you notice that, you know, your minds feel different to you? The subjective experience of being yourself is different than it was before you took the seminar and began doing the work on a regular basis? Virtually everybody raised their hand. So you want to know this work well enough for before beginning with clients that you can use the system as automatically as a musician uses a scale of notes. You want to let go for a moment of your self-story, of your self-consciousness, of your worry, of your attachment to the session outcome. Yeah. Because your attachment, oh, I really hope it works, it's got to work, is a kind of desperation. It's a communication of precisely the opposite thing that you want. You know, when a great quarterback, a Joe Montana or Tom Brady or somebody, is being rushed by these 300-pound gorilla guys, and he's waiting, he's looking downfield for that interceptor, that receiver, I should say, before he can let go of the ball. He's absolutely in focus. You know, he's absolutely in focus. There's no question in his mind, you know, what's going to happen. That's what makes a great competitive athlete. They envision success before it ever happens. And they can't see the world any other way. The world doesn't make sense unless they win. You know, the world doesn't make sense unless that pass just lands like right in that guy's hands. It doesn't make sense. And when you sit down and you're doing this work, that's the same way you have to see things. And when you are worried about outcome, it's a kind of desperation that actually communicates just the opposite signal than you intended. You want to find a place of mental openness and spaciousness within which to work. A place where you're relaxed, you're not coned down in terms of your awareness, but open and spacious. In other words, you want to allow for and encourage your communication with the whole of the universe, the whole of that universal informational field, because it's within that universal information field that you will find that client who exists as a subset within that field. So going back, kind of referencing the metaphor that I gave earlier, you want to see yourself and the client that you're working with together in a mental rowboat, using your intention and the NMT pathways that give it form and structure to navigate the currents of meaning and significance. And you want to lead the patient's consciousness to the region of time, space, and knowledge within that universal field of consciousness where the preferred potential state of transformation becomes manifested reality. That's what you're doing. The view that we've just explored of the universe and its dynamics, it suggests a new way of looking at every NMT procedure and outcome. And remember that the condition of the patient, the client, is never actually, materially, and causally what it seems to be. You're not diagnosing disease. You're not treating disease. You're changing the way the mind-body views its own reality. You're not even doing that. You're giving it an opportunity to do that. And you know what? Not everybody's going to do that. We were talking earlier about John of God, and he says, you know, get great results, have people, cancers go away, all kinds of things. He says, some people aren't going to get well. That's not the path they're on. Why? Who knows? That's reality. And our NMT interaction is never a mechanistic tinkering or micromanagement of the patient's mind-body. It's never that, and that's one of the chief misunderstandings of this work. People think that's what it's precisely the opposite of that. It's precisely the opposite. What we're doing is this. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. And that's all we're doing. So, every action in the NMT protocol is designed to lead the patient's consciousness away from the incoherence, disorder, and entropy that manifests the problem state that they present to us in, and to create a mind-body awareness of the potential to reorganize its informational structure to one that defines into existence the intended transformation of the NMT session. And in the final analysis, the universe dreams itself into existence. And we're in the business of trading bad dreams for better ones. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about.